The stars stretched endlessly before the Heritage as it glided through the darkness of space toward the neutral station orbiting Kepler 442b. Captain Daniel Wright stood on the bridge with his arms crossed and watched the distant lights of the station grow brighter with each passing moment. He had commanded vessels for 12 years, but something about this mission felt different. The weight of it pressed against his chest, like a physical thing. Beside him stood Lauren Blake, the chief diplomat who had spent months preparing for this summit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes scanned the data screens with fierce concentration. She had told Daniel 3 days ago that this summit could change everything for humanity, and he believed her, because Lauren was rarely wrong about these things. Lieutenant Chris Morgan sat at the tactical station and monitored the sensor readings with practiced efficiency. He was younger than most officers at his rank, but he had earned his position through skill and dedication. The Heritage was one of humanity's finest diplomatic vessels and carried a crew of 300 souls who all believed they were heading toward a historic moment of peace. Humanity had joined the galactic community only 15 years earlier, and the road had been difficult. The Galactic Council consisted of dozens of species, but the most powerful among them were the reptilian Vakros and the insectoid Zenthari. These two species controlled most of the Council's military might and political influence. They had made it clear from the beginning that they viewed humans as upstarts who expanded too quickly and asked uncomfortable questions about how the Council operated. The Heritage docked with the station without incident, and Daniel led the diplomatic team through the airlocks into the sprawling complex. The station was massive and built from materials that shimmered with an almost organic quality. Council architecture always looked alien to human eyes, but Daniel had learned to appreciate its strange beauty. Council Speaker Theron waited for them in the main assembly hall. He was Vakros and stood nearly 7 feet tall, with scales that gleamed like polished bronze under the artificial lights. His eyes were golden and cold, and when he smiled it showed rows of sharp teeth that made Daniel's instincts scream danger, even as his training kept him calm. The first day of talks went smoothly enough. Lauren presented humanity's proposals for fair trade routes and mutual defense agreements. The council representatives listened and asked questions and made notes. Daniel watched from his position near the back of the room and tried to read the body language of species he barely understood. Chris Morgan attended the sessions with him and kept a careful eye on the security feeds. By the second day, Daniel noticed small things that troubled him. Council military vessels were moving into positions around the Heritage. The station's defensive systems were powering up gradually and in patterns that suggested preparation rather than routine maintenance. He pulled Chris aside during a break and shared his concerns. Chris ran a quick scan and confirmed that 6 Council warships had taken up positions that formed a perfect firing solution on the Heritage and the 2 escort vessels that had accompanied them. The USS Destiny and the USS Courage floated nearby with their crews unaware of the danger. Daniel wanted to raise an alarm, but he had no proof of hostile intent, and causing a scene could destroy any chance at real peace. He decided to wait but ordered Chris to keep the Heritage on standby for an emergency departure. On the 3rd day, everything fell apart. Daniel sat in the assembly hall as Lauren finished her presentation on cultural exchange programs when Speaker Theron rose from his seat. The room fell silent. Theron's voice echoed through the chamber as he spoke, and his words turned Daniel's blood to ice. The Council had never intended peace. They had lured humanity's diplomatic corps and some of their best ships into a carefully planned trap. Theron explained with cold precision that humanity represented a threat to the established galactic order. Humans expanded too aggressively and questioned authority too freely and showed too much potential for rapid advancement. The Council had decided that humanity needed to be crushed before they became powerful enough to challenge the existing hierarchy. Daniel was moving before Theron finished speaking. He grabbed Lauren and pulled her toward the exit as chaos erupted around them. Council security forces moved to block the doors, but Chris had anticipated this and had positioned 2 Marines near each exit. The fighting was brief and brutal. Daniel's team fought their way back to the Heritage through corridors that filled with smoke and the sounds of weapons fire. Behind them, the station's weapons systems opened fire on the 2 escort vessels. Daniel watched through the Heritage's view screens as the Destiny took a direct hit to her main reactor. The explosion was blinding. 300 lives ended in a fraction of a second. The Courage tried to return fire, but 6 Council warships focused their weapons on her and tore her apart piece by piece. Chris Morgan stood at the tactical station with tears streaming down his face as he watched the Courage die. Lieutenant Commander Karen Phillips commanded that ship, and she had been Chris's instructor at the academy and his mentor and his friend. He watched helplessly as her ship broke apart and scattered debris across the void. Daniel ordered maximum power to the engines, and the Heritage shook as her drives pushed beyond safe limits. Council weapons fire tracked them as they fled, but Chris managed to angle the shields to absorb the worst of it. The Heritage's hull buckled in 3 places, and fires broke out on 2 decks, but she held together through skill and luck and sheer determination. They made it to the jump point with emergency power and translated into hyperspace as more Council vessels closed in behind them. Daniel collapsed into his command chair once they were safe and stared at the damage reports scrolling across his screens. 2 ships destroyed. Over 600 people dead. Karen Phillips and so many others who had trusted that this summit represented hope for the future. Lauren sat at the navigation station and cried quietly. Chris worked mechanically at his console and saved the names of every person who died that day into the Heritage's memory banks. Daniel Wright made a decision in that moment that would change everything. The Council expected humans to either surrender in fear or lash out in rage. They would do neither. Humanity would remember every single person who died at Kepler 442. They would remember every name and every face and every dream that died with those ships. And they would make the Council understand what it meant to wrong a species that never forgot. 6 months passed, and humanity changed in ways the Galactic Council could never have predicted. The massacre at Kepler 442 became a rallying point that united every human colony and nation and faction under a single burning purpose. Admiral Helen Carter took command of the newly formed Terran Defense Fleet from her flagship positioned in orbit above Mars. She was 62 years old with gray hair cut military short and eyes that had seen combat on 3 different colony worlds during humanity's expansion into space. She understood war, and she understood that rage without discipline led only to defeat. What the Council had done required a response that was cold and calculated and absolutely merciless in its precision. Helen established a protocol she called the Remembrance Initiative within the first week of her command. Every human military vessel now carried a memorial wall in a prominent location where crew members would see it daily. The walls displayed the names and faces of all 643 people who died when the Destiny and Courage were destroyed. Every morning briefing across the entire fleet began with a moment of silence. Every strategic planning session included survivors from the Heritage who could speak about what happened and ensure that emotion never clouded judgment, but memory fueled every decision. The Council had killed what they thought were nameless enemies. Humanity would prove that every single person mattered. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Cross became one of Helen's most trusted advisors despite his relatively junior rank. He had been the Heritage's chief engineer and had kept that ship alive through impossible damage during the escape from Kepler 442. Nathan understood systems and logistics, and how to make limited resources accomplish extraordinary things. He worked alongside Dr. Lisa Ward, who had spent 8 years studying Council species before the massacre. Lisa held 3 degrees in xenopsychology and had written papers that predicted increasing tensions between humanity and the Council. She took no satisfaction in being proven right. Together, Nathan and Lisa formed the core of a strategic planning group tasked with understanding how humanity could fight a war against an enemy with superior numbers and resources. The answer came from an unexpected place. Lisa spent weeks reviewing every piece of data humanity had gathered about Council species and their cultures. She noticed a pattern that seemed almost too convenient to be real. Every major Council species had evolved in relatively stable environments, with clear hierarchical structures. Their conflicts followed ritualized patterns, with established rules about when to fight and when to submit. Grudges among Council species typically lasted no more than a generation, and were often resolved through formal ceremonies or symbolic gestures. The concept of maintaining focused anger across multiple generations was completely alien to their psychology. They had no cultural framework for understanding a species that wrote down their grievances and taught them to children and passed them down through centuries. Nathan and Lisa presented their findings to Admiral Carter and the Strategic Planning Committee in a meeting that lasted 6 hours. The key insight was simple but profound. The Council expected humanity to follow the same behavioral patterns as every other species they had encountered. They anticipated either a quick submission or a brief explosive retaliation that could be crushed with overwhelming force. They had absolutely no experience dealing with a species whose entire history was filled with examples of multi-generational vengeance. Humans remembered the Trojan War 3,000 years after it happened. They taught their children about ancient injustices and kept grudges alive across centuries. Every human culture had stories about revenge, served cold, and debts paid in full, regardless of how much time passed. Helen Carter listened to their presentation and understood immediately. The Council had handed humanity an enormous advantage without realizing it. Humanity would not seek immediate revenge through costly direct confrontation. Instead, they would fight a war of patience and precision that exploited the Council's complete inability to comprehend how human memory worked. Every strike would be calculated. Every target would be chosen to inflict maximum strategic damage while avoiding civilian casualties that might unite Council species against humanity. And every action would be tied explicitly to the memory of specific individuals who died at Kepler 442. The cultural response across human space happened organically, without government direction. Musicians composed songs about the fallen that became anthems played at sporting events and ceremonies. Artists created detailed portraits of each victim that were displayed in public spaces on every human world. Schools began teaching units about Kepler 442, where children learned not just what happened, but who died and what their dreams had been. Karen Phillips had wanted to open a flight school after retirement. Gregory Santos had been planning his wedding. Maya Johnson had just received news that her sister gave birth to twins. These were not statistics. They were people whose stories became woven into human culture. Nathan worked with engineering teams across the fleet to develop new weapon systems and defensive technologies. Humanity's ships were individually outmatched by Council vessels, but Nathan found ways to offset that disadvantage through innovation and unconventional tactics. He designed missile systems that could be fired from unexpected angles and point defense networks that compensated for inferior shielding through superior targeting algorithms. Every improvement was tested rigorously because there would be no second chances. Lisa, meanwhile, developed psychological profiles of Council leadership and predicted how they would respond to different types of attacks. She identified weak points in their alliance structure and species that might be persuaded to break away from the Council if presented with the right evidence and incentives. Admiral Carter approved Operation Longview as humanity's first major offensive action. The plan was complex and involved multiple strike teams hitting Council infrastructure across a dozen systems simultaneously. Each target was carefully chosen for maximum strategic impact. Supply depots that fed Council military operations, shipyards that built their warships, communication hubs that coordinated their forces. Nothing that would kill civilians, but everything that would hurt their ability to wage war. Daniel Wright volunteered to lead one of the strike teams, and Helen gave him command of the rebuilt Heritage. The ship had spent 4 months in dock being repaired and upgraded with Nathan's new weapon systems. Her crew was smaller now, and harder. They had all lost friends at Kepler 442, and they understood what this mission meant. Across human space, preparations continued with grim determination. The Council had started this war, expecting a quick victory or an easy submission. They were about to learn that humanity did not forgive and did not forget. Every ship that launched carried the names of the dead engraved on bulkheads where crew members would see them every day. Every pilot wore a patch with a specific victim's name and kept their photo in their cockpit. The Council thought they had eliminated a threat. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous than an aggressive rival. They had created an entire species united by grief and memory, and an absolute determination to ensure that what happened at Kepler 442 would never happen to anyone ever again. 8 months after the betrayal at Kepler 442, the Terran Defense Fleet launched its first coordinated strike against Council holdings, but not in the way anyone expected. Commander Ryan Foster led a team of intelligence specialists who had spent those months gathering evidence and building a case that would shake the foundations of galactic politics. Ryan was 34 years old and had worked in naval intelligence before the massacre. He understood that wars were fought with information as much as weapons, and he had assembled a team of the best analysts and hackers and communications experts humanity could provide. Among them was Amy Chen, who could break encryption systems that other species considered unbreakable. She had spent 6 weeks cracking into Council-secure channels, and what she found was exactly what they needed. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Council communications between Speaker Theron and High Commander Vrekis of the Zenthari showed detailed planning for the Kepler 442 trap dating back 4 months before the summit. Internal memos discussed how to position military assets without alerting human observers. Contingency plans outlined how to deal with survivor testimony and manipulate galactic media to present the attack as justified self-defense against human aggression. Most damaging were recordings of Theron, explaining to his inner circle that the massacre needed to happen to maintain Council dominance and prevent other species from getting ideas about challenging the established order. Ryan and Amy compiled everything into a comprehensive package with timestamps and authentication codes and corroborating evidence from multiple sources. Then they released it simultaneously on every major galactic news network and communication channel. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for Council credibility. Species across the galaxy, who had remained neutral or tacitly supported the Council, suddenly had proof that the attack was unprovoked and premeditated. The Kelthan Collective issued a statement condemning the massacre within hours of the evidence release. The Kelthan were an arthropod species who valued honor in warfare above almost everything else. They had fought wars against other Council species in the past, but always with declared intentions and clear rules of engagement. The idea of luring diplomats to a peace summit only to murder them violated every principle they held sacred. The Morsai, an aquatic species known for their diplomatic skills, withdrew their ambassadors from Council space and demanded a formal investigation. Smaller species who had feared Council retaliation found courage in numbers and added their voices to the growing outcry. Speaker Theron tried to contain the damage with public statements claiming the evidence was falsified or taken out of context. His denials fell flat when Amy Chen released the authentication protocols that proved every document and recording was genuine. Council unity began to fracture as species that had supported the attack distanced themselves from the decision. Trade agreements that had stood for decades collapsed as partners refused to do business with entities that endorsed treachery. The Council's reputation as guarantors of galactic stability crumbled. Ryan Foster watched the chaos unfold from a monitoring station on Mars and allowed himself a small smile. This was the first lesson. Humanity would not just remember what was done to them. They would ensure the entire galaxy remembered too. Admiral Carter authorized Operation Longview to begin while the Council reeled from the intelligence leak. Captain Daniel Wright led a squadron of 6 vessels toward the Vakros supply depot at Tau Ceti. The depot was a massive orbital complex that stored weapons and fuel and replacement parts for Council military operations across 3 sectors. Nathan Cross had identified it as a critical node in their logistics network. Destroying it would not kill civilians, but would cripple Council military readiness in the region for months. The Heritage approached the depot with running lights dark and emissions minimized. Council sensors were designed to detect large fleet movements, not small strike forces using irregular approach vectors. Daniel's squadron slipped through their detection grid and positioned themselves around the depot like wolves surrounding prey. The attack lasted 17 minutes from first shot to final detonation. Human missiles struck with precision that left the Council defenders no time to mount an effective response. Every warhead was targeted on military stockpiles and fuel reserves, and none on the habitation sections where civilian workers lived. Explosions rippled through the depot in cascading failures as ammunition cooked off and reactor containment fields collapsed. Daniel watched from the Heritage's bridge as the massive structure tore itself apart. Chris Morgan coordinated targeting solutions and made sure every shot counted. When the depot was reduced to glowing wreckage, the squadron prepared to withdraw. Daniel ordered communications to broadcast on all council frequencies in the system. What happened next became a template that would be repeated across council space. Daniel's voice carried across the void, calm and clear, and absolutely merciless. He began reading names. Karen Phillips, Commander of the USS Courage; Gregory Santos, Chief Medical Officer of the USS Destiny; Maya Johnson, Pilot First Class. He read every single name of every person who died at Kepler 442. It took 37 minutes. Council ships that had been racing to respond to the attack slowed as their commanders listened. Some tried to jam the transmission, but Daniel's communications officer had anticipated that and broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously. When the last name was read, Daniel added 4 words that chilled every council officer who heard them. "We remember them all." Then the Heritage and her squadron jumped to hyperspace and vanished. The pattern repeated across council territory over the following weeks. Human strike teams hit military targets with surgical precision while avoiding any civilian casualties. Each attack was followed by the same ritual: the reading of names. Sometimes it was all 643. Sometimes it was a specific subset chosen to match the scale of the target. A fuel depot might hear 20 names. A shipyard might hear 50. The psychological effect on council forces was profound and completely unexpected. Their commanders realized they were not fighting a conventional war for territory or resources. They were fighting a war of memory against a species that turned grief into weapons. Every strike carried a label. This attack for Karen Phillips. This destruction for Gregory Santos. This pain for Maya Johnson. Speaker Theron called an emergency council session and tried to rally support for a massive counteroffensive against human space. He argued that humanity's attacks proved they were the aggressors and justified the original strike at Kepler 442. His speech fell flat. Too many council species had seen the evidence of premeditation. Too many had begun to fear that they might be next if they displeased the Vakros or Zenthari leadership. The Kelthan representative stood and delivered a scathing response that pointed out the difference between humanity's surgical strikes on military targets and the Council's murder of diplomats. The session ended in chaos, with no consensus and no unified response. The Council that had ruled galactic politics for 2 centuries was fracturing under the weight of its own treachery. Daniel Wright brought the Heritage home after 5 successful strikes against Council targets. His crew was exhausted but unbroken. They had lost 3 people in a brief firefight at one of the targets but had given far better than they got. Daniel stood before the memorial wall in the Heritage's main corridor and added 3 new names to those already displayed. He promised each one that their deaths would not be forgotten either. Across human space, similar scenes played out on dozens of ships. The war had only begun, but humanity had already taught the Council something they never expected to learn. Humans did not just remember the dead. They honored them through action and made sure their enemies never forgot either. 14 months after Kepler 442, the war had evolved into something the Galactic Council never imagined possible. Humanity's methodical campaign of retribution had crippled Council logistics across 8 sectors and destroyed their reputation among dozens of neutral species. Trade routes that had operated for centuries now stood empty, as merchant vessels refused to guarantee deliveries to Council worlds. Alliance structures that seemed permanent had fractured into competing factions, as species questioned whether supporting the Vakros and Zenthari leadership was worth the economic and political cost. Council military commanders found themselves fighting not just human strike forces, but also paranoia and doubt among their own ranks. Major Kyle Bennett prepared for a mission that would demonstrate just how far humanity was willing to go. Kyle commanded a Marine unit of 48 soldiers who specialized in operations that conventional forces could not accomplish. He was 39 years old and had led troops through conflicts on the colony worlds before humanity ever encountered the Council. His face carried scars from a transport crash that killed 6 of his unit 5 years earlier, and he never let himself forget their names either. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell served as his intelligence officer and cultural advisor. She had spent 2 years living among Zenthari communities during the brief period when relations between humans and Council seemed promising. Sarah understood their hive psychology and social structures better than any other human alive. Together, they planned an operation that seemed impossible. They were going to infiltrate the Zenthari hive world of Nexus Prime and capture High Commander Vrekis, who had helped plan the Kepler 442 massacre. Nexus Prime was one of the most heavily defended worlds in Council space. The planet's surface consisted of massive hive complexes that housed billions of Zenthari in interconnected tunnels and chambers. The architecture was organic and constantly shifting as worker drones built new sections and modified old ones. Human intelligence suggested that Vrekis commanded operations from a chamber deep within the primary hive complex beneath what Zenthari considered sacred ground. Getting to him meant penetrating kilometers of tunnels filled with warrior drones and security systems designed to detect intrusion by scent and vibration and electromagnetic signature. Sarah had identified a possible route that used service tunnels maintained by lower caste workers who were often ignored by warrior drones. The plan required Kyle's team to move through those tunnels for 6 hours without being detected by a species whose entire evolution was based on detecting threats to the hive. The insertion went perfectly because Nathan Cross had designed a transport system that could place Marines precisely where they needed to be. Kyle's team materialized in a service tunnel 3 kilometers below the hive's surface at exactly midnight local time, when worker traffic was at its lowest. They wore suits that masked their thermal signatures and chemical signatures, and moved with absolute silence through passages barely tall enough for humans. Sarah guided them using maps she had constructed from intelligence reports and her own memories of hive architecture. Every 100 meters, they paused and listened for patrols. The Zenthari communicated through pheromones and subsonic vibrations that human equipment could detect but not interpret. Sarah had learned to recognize warning patterns and twice directed the team into side passages to avoid warrior patrols. 6 hours later, they reached the chamber where Vrekis conducted his operations. The High Commander was alone, except for 4 warrior guards, who stood at attention near the entrance. Kyle's team used flash charges that overloaded Zenthari sensory organs and incapacitated the guards in seconds. Vrekis tried to trigger an alarm, but Sarah jammed the signal with equipment designed specifically for this purpose. Kyle approached the High Commander, who stood nearly 8 feet tall, with an exoskeleton that gleamed black under the chamber's bioluminescent lighting. Vrekis's compound eyes tracked Kyle with insectoid precision. The High Commander spoke in the clicking language of his species. Sarah translated. He wanted to know what humans thought they could accomplish by this intrusion. Kyle's response was simple. They were taking him home to learn something important. The extraction was harder than the insertion, because now the hive knew intruders were present. Alarms rippled through the complex as warrior drones mobilized and began systematic sweeps. Kyle's team moved fast through passages that suddenly filled with hostile forces. They fought running battles through 3 kilometers of tunnel, using weapons that fired projectiles designed to penetrate Zenthari armor. Sarah carried equipment that released pheromone signals, mimicking hive evacuation orders. The false signals created confusion among warrior drones, who received conflicting instructions from their chemical communication network. It bought enough time for the team to reach the extraction point, where Nathan's transport system pulled them back to human space. Kyle lost 2 Marines in the fighting, and 3 more were injured badly enough to require immediate medical attention. But they had Vrekis. Admiral Helen Carter met with the High Commander personally in a secured facility on Mars. The room was bare, except for 2 chairs and a large display screen. Helen sat across from Vrekis and studied him for a long moment before speaking. She did not threaten him or promise punishment. Instead, she showed him the memorial walls that now existed on every human military vessel. She made him read every name aloud in his clicking language, while Sarah provided pronunciation guidance. It took him 4 hours. Then Helen showed him videos of human children in classrooms, learning about Kepler 442. She showed him the songs, and the artwork, and the ceremonies. She explained human history and gave examples of conflicts that humans remembered for thousands of years. The Trojan War, the Holocaust, events that shaped entire cultures and were passed down through countless generations. Helen let Vrekis absorb what he was seeing before delivering her message. his children's children would still be answering for what he and Theron had done. Every Xanthari for the next millennium would know that their species participated in murdering diplomats under the guise of peace. This was not a threat. It was a promise. But Helen offered him something else, too. One chance to end this before it became permanent. The Council could acknowledge their crime publicly. They could provide reparations to the families of those killed. They could establish a permanent memorial at Kepler 442 and guarantee through binding treaty that nothing like this would ever happen again. If they did these things, humanity would cease offensive operations and work toward genuine peace. If they refused, humanity would continue this war for generations if necessary, and make sure that the Council's treachery became the defining example in galactic history of what happened when you betrayed those who never forget. Helen released Vrekis back to Council space after 3 days. She sent him with recordings of everything he had seen and learned. The High Commander returned to Nexus Prime, changed by the experience. He reported to the Council emergency session that convened to discuss his capture, and what he had learned terrified them more than any military defeat. The Council leadership began to understand what they had created. They had not just attacked humanity. They had made themselves into eternal enemies of a species that turned memory into weapons and would never stop until justice was served. Meanwhile, Captain Daniel Wright and the Heritage responded to a distress call from a Vakros colony under attack by space pirates who had taken advantage of the chaos to raid vulnerable targets. Daniel debated for 10 seconds before ordering his crew to intervene. They drove off the pirates and saved thousands of Vakros civilians who stared in confusion at their rescuers. Daniel explained to the colony governor that humanity was at war with Council leadership, not with innocent civilians. Humans understood the difference between soldiers and families. The governor broadcast what happened across Council space, where it created more confusion and doubt among populations who had been told that humans were monsters bent on genocide. How could a species seeking revenge still choose to save their enemies? The answer was simple, but Council species struggled to comprehend it. Humans never forgot wrongs, but they also never stopped being human even in the midst of war. 18 months after Kepler 442, Speaker Theron made his final and most catastrophic miscalculation. He had watched his political power erode as Council species questioned his leadership, and human strikes crippled military infrastructure. The evidence of premeditation that Ryan Foster released had destroyed his credibility among neutral worlds. High Commander Vrekis returned from his capture, telling terrifying stories about human memory and generational vengeance that made even hardened Xanthari warriors nervous. Trade routes stood empty, and alliance structures crumbled, and whispers of his removal from power grew louder each day. Theron decided he needed a decisive victory to restore Council unity and prove that humanity could be defeated. He ordered a massive strike directly against Earth itself. The plan was simple in its arrogance. Theron assembled a fleet of 80 warships drawn from Vakros and Xanthari forces, along with smaller contingents from species that still supported Council leadership. Admiral Krell commanded the armada from his flagship and had orders to jump into the solar system and destroy human military installations around Earth and Mars. The strike was meant to break human morale and force immediate surrender. Krell was a veteran commander who had won battles against a dozen species over 40 years of service. He believed the plan was sound because intelligence reports suggested that most of humanity's military strength was deployed on offensive operations across Council space. Earth would be vulnerable, and the humans would finally learn the cost of their defiance. The Council fleet entered the solar system, expecting to catch humanity off guard. Instead, they found themselves facing the entire Terran defense fleet, arrayed in defensive positions that had clearly been prepared for months. Admiral Helen Carter had positioned her forces in layers around Earth and Luna and Mars, with overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions that turned the inner system into a killing ground. She had anticipated this exact move, because Lisa Ward predicted that Theron would eventually overreach when political pressure became unbearable. Helen had quietly recalled ships from offensive operations over the past 6 weeks and assembled a force that matched the Council fleet in numbers and surpassed it in coordination and motivation. Admiral Krell stared at his tactical displays in shock as human vessels lit up across his sensors. He had commanded fleets for decades, but he had never seen defensive positions this carefully prepared. The humans had turned their home system into a fortress, and they were daring the council to attack. Krell hesitated because his advantage in surprise was gone, and now he faced a prepared enemy fighting to defend their homeworld. He sent a request back to Council Space asking for instructions, but the time delay meant he would not receive a response for hours. His orders from Theron were clear. Attack and destroy human military capability. Krell gave the command to advance. The battle was fierce and brutal, and mercifully brief. Human ships fought with desperation and skill that came from 18 months of constant warfare. Captain Daniel Wright commanded the Heritage as part of a squadron that hit the Council left flank with coordinated missile strikes. Commander Ryan Foster led frigates in slashing attacks that broke up Council formations. Major Kyle Bennett and his Marines boarded a Zenthari cruiser and disabled its command systems from the inside. Lieutenant Jake Morrison piloted a fighter that took down 3 Council vessels before his craft was damaged and he had to eject. Captain Emma Stone commanded a destroyer that went toe-to-toe with a Vakros battleship twice her size and somehow survived through superior maneuvering and sheer audacity. Admiral Krell watched his carefully planned attack dissolve into chaos. His ships were individually superior to human vessels, but humanity had learned how to fight in ways that negated that advantage. They used irregular tactics and concentrated fire, and refused to engage in the kind of stand-up battles that Council doctrine anticipated. Worse, his crews were demoralized after 18 months of human strikes and uncertain whether this war was even justified. When the Council Center collapsed under concentrated fire from Helen's command squadron, Krell made the decision to retreat. His fleet scattered and jumped to hyperspace, pursued by human forces, who harried them all the way to the system's edge. The Council had lost 23 ships, destroyed, and 15 more heavily damaged. Human casualties were lighter, because they fought from prepared positions and knew exactly what they were defending. Admiral Helen Carter broadcast her message while debris from the battle still glowed in orbit around Earth. She ensured that every Council world would receive her transmission by sending it on every frequency and through every communication network that Ryan's intelligence teams could access. Helen stood before the memorial wall aboard her flagship with the faces of Kepler 442 victims behind her. She looked directly into the camera and spoke with quiet intensity that carried more weight than any shouting could. She addressed Speaker Theron by name and told him that he came to Earth thinking humans would forget or forgive or follow the same patterns as every other species. But humans had a saying: they did not forgive and they did not forget. They were patient, but they were not merciful to those who murdered diplomats under false pretenses of peace. Helen's voice never rose, but her words cut like weapons. Today marked the day when the Council learned what happened when they betrayed humanity. They had spent 18 months learning about human memory and human patience and human ability to fight wars that other species could not imagine. But she was not finished. Helen did something that shocked every Council leader watching. She offered terms, not surrender, but accountability. The Council must acknowledge their crime publicly before the entire galaxy. They must honor the dead with permanent memorials at Kepler 442. They must provide reparations to the families who lost loved ones. They must submit to a joint tribunal for war crimes with judges drawn from neutral species. If they did these things, humanity would cease offensive operations immediately and work toward genuine, lasting peace. If they refused, humanity would continue this war for centuries if necessary, and ensure that Kepler 442 became the defining cautionary tale in galactic history. Speaker Theron watched the transmission from his chambers on the Council home world. He had spent 18 months dismissing human capabilities and insisting that they would follow predictable patterns. He had been wrong about everything. The Council emergency session convened within hours, and the debate was intense and sometimes violent. The Kelthan representative demanded Theron's immediate removal from power. The Morsai called for acceptance of human terms. Even some Vakros and Zenthari delegates questioned whether continuing this war served any purpose. Theron tried to rally support, but his authority was gone. The Council had started a war they could not win against an enemy they did not understand. Within 3 days, Theron was removed from power and placed under arrest pending trial. A Kelthan diplomat named Sorath, who had opposed the massacre from the beginning, took leadership of a reformed council. 3 months later, representatives from across the galaxy gathered at Kepler 442 for the dedication of a permanent memorial station. The structure orbited the planet where the massacre happened and contained the names of every person who died engraved in materials that would last for millennia. Admiral Helen Carter stood beside Sorath and other council leaders, who came to acknowledge what had been done. Lauren Blake recovered from injuries she sustained during the original attack and spoke about building peace on foundations of memory rather than forgetting. She explained that humanity was not seeking revenge but justice and recognition that what happened mattered. Captain Daniel Wright read the names one final time, but this time it was part of a ceremony that turned private grief into shared remembrance. The galaxy watched as humans and council species stood together before the memorial. Children from multiple worlds attended, including humans and Kelthan and Morsai, and even some young Vakros and Zenthari whose parents wanted them to understand the cost of treachery. Dr. Lisa Ward told reporters that the galaxy had learned an important lesson about humanity. Humans never forgot wrongs done to them, but they also never stopped being human even in the darkest moments. Nathan Cross stood with survivors from the heritage and the families of the fallen, and said simply that memory was not just about the past. It was about ensuring the future held space for justice and dignity, and peace built on truth rather than convenient forgetting. The story spread across the galaxy through countless retellings. The species that never forgets. The war fought with memory as much as weapons. The enemies who became partners through acknowledgement rather than denial. Human children continued to learn about Kepler 442 inches their schools, but now alien children learned about it too. The Council's attempt to eliminate humanity as a threat had instead taught the galaxy something profound. Some species remember for generations and carry those memories not as burden, but as responsibility. The memorial station became a place of pilgrimage where people came to understand that peace without justice was only delayed conflict. Speaker Theron faced trial and was convicted, but the real punishment was knowing that his name would forever be associated with treachery, while the names of those he murdered were honored. Admiral Helen Carter retired 2 years later, knowing that humanity had proven something important. They had shown the galaxy that strength, combined with memory and justice, created something more powerful than mere military might. They had shown that humans never forgot, but also never stopped reaching for something better.